Welcome to Against the Tide, the podcast where extraordinary social changemakers share their stories and wisdom. More than a podcast, Against the Tide is a celebration of courageous women who defy expectation to create lasting impact by daring to forge their own paths. We'll dive deep into powerful themes such as embracing discomfort for transformative change, how your past needn't determine your future, and how breaking free from societal labels unlocks your true potential. Join me, Jo Metcalf, to hear stories of incredible women who, by swimming against the tide, prove that extraordinary things can happen. Ready to be inspired? Today, I have great pleasure in introducing Caroline Leo, a plain-speaking, go-getting communication strategist on a mission to improve workplace cultures. Caroline left the fast-paced world of corporate communications to create her own agency 5 years ago. She has since advised brands as varied as Hyatt Hotels and the charity SmartWorks. Caroline specialises in integrated communications and campaign strategy, working with businesses, non-profits, and coalitions to tell genuine, value-led stories. Caroline recently authored the report We Need to Talk About Culture, which asks, if culture is so critical to growth, why is it not being given the same strategic focus as a company's brand, reputation, or products? Join us as we delve into Caroline's motivations for developing her insightful and practical 8-point guide to culture. Okay, so welcome, Caroline, and thank you so much for joining the podcast today. Really appreciate it. We're going to start with a bit about your background and your influences. So, what led you into corporate communications?
Getting into corporate communications was a complete accident. It was a classic case of leaving school, leaving college, having very bad careers advice at that stage, and just not really knowing what to do or what I really wanted to do. The only thing I had in mind is that I wanted to do something a little bit creative. I liked reading, I liked writing. Um, And after a few jobs, I got in as a secretary at a global PR firm and started working there. And I thought, this could be it. It felt like my people. It was fast paced, quite creative. And so I just sort of worked hard and worked my way up and sort of transferred over and ended up as at my last place. I was a partner heading up a team of about, 80 plus consultants with a few other partners. So that was the route. So a pure accident.
How did those early career choices, how did those early roles shape you in terms of where you are now?
I I I guess it's sort of they formed in me despite what you might think to the contrary reading the news, particularly at the moment, but that very much that business was a force for good. I believed that most businesses were made up of people that just wanted to do half decent things. Do you know what I mean? And I didn't really buy into the sort of bad corporate mentality. I liked the people element of it, and I liked getting to know people and understanding businesses and why they were into things. I felt that any business could be interesting. I think with communications, it's about storytelling, and I liked the challenge of making a story, like an engaging story about everything from companies that make paint to companies that sell chocolate, whatever. Um, but I did think, and probably this is a lot of what shaped my approach to communications as I've got slightly older, um, is that it should just be simple. Like good communications is about simplicity. It's about telling a clear story well and simply. And I felt lots of what happened in agencies was a lot of nonsense. Do you know what I mean? It was kind of It was a lot of theatre and a lot of fancy words that no one understood, and trying to appear more clever than everyone else. And I felt that a lot of that was unnecessary in that industry, which is not rocket science or surgery. It's about communications. Um, so I think that shaped me.
Who influenced your communication style?
I think in terms of communicators and storytellers, for me, it was always about the people I was always inspired by were people like, you know, great sort of female actresses like Judi Dench, Julie Waters, those kind of no nonsense, brilliant, just didn't really care that much about what people thought of them, but just could tell a story, just really knew how to make the mundane magnificent. You could listen to them for hours and hours as they sort of spun yarns. That those are always the sort of communicators that I was inspired by. And I think applying that very human way of telling stories to corporate communications, that's always been the sort of the joy for me. If you can do that, in very small ways every day, then that's the sort of thing that kept me interested in the business.
What is the difference between somebody that can do something that's simple and someone that overcomplicates things? What have you really noticed?
Great communicators understand their audience. So a great actor will deliver lines to you. There'll be thousands of people in an audience at a theatre, and it feels like they're speaking to you. And I think that is the art of great communication. And I think often people who are communicators or natural communicators, people who like to stand on stages or give speeches, they don't really care how the message is being received. They just care that people are listening to them. And I think that's the difference. I think in the industry, particularly in some of the agencies I've worked at, there were always lots of people within that industry and those businesses that sort of just liked the sound of their own voice and liked to talk, liked to communicate, liked to sort of put messages out there. But the best communicators were always those that cared how those messages landed. So who are we actually talking to and what do they want to hear? And I think that is the subtle but incredibly significant difference between a good and a bad communicator, in my view.
Great. So you've helped build teams. So tell us about your experience in building teams and helping companies to grow.
So in my first agency, and I sort of fell into it by accident, but I started working with, I think because I was so obsessed with the sort of human element of it. In communications, you go into different sectors or specialisms, and mine was never sort of finance or accounting or those. Mine was always more consumer facing brands. So I liked businesses that sold things to people like me. I understood that. And that was where it all kind of started, helping people, those sort of organizations through periods of transformation. And so it started off with big global brands that we used to work for, because there was big global agencies. So, they were attracting big global businesses. And it was things like and this is going back a long time, but when Starbucks first really started making a presence in the UK and expanding, it was working with them. And that was a big organization that just assumed, because in America everyone loved Starbucks, that in the UK everyone would love Starbucks. And so they started talking about um, uh, over the next 5 years, our growth strategy is XYZ. There's going to be a Starbucks on every street corner, thinking that would be received really well by a UK audience. And it turns out it wasn't well received at all, and everyone hated it. And there was big campaigns at a local level. The Evening Standard ran our sort of Save Our Small Shops campaign, and it was about the homogenization of the high street, and that these big brands were a very bad thing. And that was a classic case of not understanding who you're talking to and not thinking through the audience. So they had to change the strategy, change the communications, and have a much sort of gentler approach to how they were growing and expanding across the UK. So I've worked for a lot of organisations like that are going through sort of periods of change. That's where it sort of started. But as my career went on, I started getting a little bit more into, so these businesses that were going through transformation, as well as their communications, what else needed to change, and started to think a little bit more about the teams that sat behind those communications and the importance of motivating, communicating with, getting people on board behind the strategy of the business, particularly when the strategy changed very quickly. You know, we're going this way. Oh no, we're going this way. So what does that mean for the people within the business? How does that need to change? Do you need to motivate them differently? Do you need to have different structures? Do you need to have stronger leadership? Do you need to be more creative or innovative to meet the strategy that you're bringing in? Because it can be very jarring, I think, when you work at an organization and all of a sudden overnight it's like, "Ooh, we're changing, we're going in a different direction." So started to do a little bit more of that, of how you kind of bring the teams with you. And I think a nice example of a recent one was, I worked with an organization called SmartWorks. It's a charity that they exist. It's a sort of female led charity that, and the whole mission is to get um, women into jobs. That's the sole focus. And so they take women often from sort of marginalized communities, and they give them clothes, and they give them some mentoring in terms of how to get through an interview. And they have a sort of mid 70% success rate of getting women into jobs. We worked with them, and it was just when Meghan Markle she was announced as a trustee, and they went from very small to very mainstream very quickly, as you can imagine. And they grew very quickly. They were expanding regionally, and a big part of the work that I was doing then with the chief exec at the time was, how do you get a small organization that does a lot to grow very quickly, and how do you put all of the processes on board, which are, giving everyone really clear development plans, thinking about the structures of the teams, what kind of training do people need to move quickly from this role to that role to take on management responsibilities. How do you put the processes in place to respond quickly to media inquiries, to fundraising, all of the bits that sort of go with it. But it was trying to do those whilst running very fast, so that was a big part of what I did with them, and that kind of prompted some of the sort of work that I've done in more recent times. So it's the combining. I think whereas my work previously was all about external communications, it then became about putting the processes and the structure in place to give the people delivering those communications and the success of that business, which is ultimately all communications is communicating what a business is doing.
And why do you think good communication is important for organisations at periods of growth?
Because often when a business is expanding really quickly, it forgets to tell people, like, quite simply, it's so busy doing what it's doing that it forgets to bring people with it. And I think so often businesses, depend on lots of things to come with them at pace. Most businesses have some sort of supply chain. So, if you're selling something, are you making it as quickly as you can sell it? Or as you make more things, do you have the processes in place to be ethical, sustainable? Are you thinking about all of these elements as well? Are you bringing on board the right stakeholders? Do you have a talent pipeline? Are you staying close to and understanding, the government policy requirements for your business? All of these elements that require going out and talking to people. Sometimes businesses are so busy doing, they forget to do that element of it. And those are all critical ingredients of sort of fast growth, is making sure that everyone comes with you, because you see it so often when businesses grow really quick or they expand really rapidly, and all of a sudden they come crashing down, um, because the supply chain wasn't built to last, or that this didn't happen, or they couldn't hire quick enough, or turns out there was a really toxic workplace culture and that all crashes down. um, so yeah, I just think communications is just a very critical part of being a good and healthy business.
Mhm. Fantastic. And as you know, the title of the podcast is Swimming Against the Tide. What resonated to you about the theme, Swimming Against the Tide?
I think I, I think lots of people who go on to do interesting things at some point in their life have to do that, right? They have to choose to do things a different way. Um, and sort of from my early days, I think lots of people were doing okay things, but it was very sort of cookie cutter. And from early on in my career, I just thought, I want to do things slightly differently. I think there is a slightly different way of doing things. And I'm fascinated by people who kind of just choose to sort of do things differently. I love having conversations with people who just sort of, well, everyone else did that, but actually I did it this way instead, because why not? I like people who think that way. But then I think also as you get a bit older, um, you kind of realize that sort of everyone is, in one way or another. Everyone is swimming against some sort of tide. It's no one goes through life scot-free, I don't think. And for most people, there is something that they're having to deal with or overcome or work through. Um, and I think that is sort of quite an enlightening thing to understand in the end, that lots of people are swimming against their own tides at various stages in their lives. Um, and I also just think, challenge makes you stronger. It doesn't feel like it at the time, but the more um, these are like all of these things are sort of opportunities for self-development, aren't they? Like you go through sort of up against obstacles or barriers, and it's how you kind of dust yourself off from that really matters.
I sense within there's a bit of a story. So, can you tell us about how you've been swimming against the tide?
Yeah, I thought it was. I've reflected on this quite a lot actually, and it's interesting. When I was younger, well, I've got two older brothers, and my household when I was young was just sort of very equal. You know, we all there wasn't a sort of, well, the boys do this and the girls do that. It was kind of very much whatever the boys were doing, I was doing. And I felt like I grew up in a very equality focused environment, and so I spent a lot of my early years in my career thinking this glass ceiling thing, not really seeing any evidence of that. Um, which I realize now was an incredibly naive thing to think. Um, and and then and then you do, and then you come up against it, and it's quite jaw dropping actually, getting to a certain level, and then you see it everywhere. And I think just early days careers, I just sort of got on and got promoted, and it was like, oh, this is all right. I don't see the problem here. And then you get to a certain level, and every woman you speak to has got a story to tell you about being excluded from opportunities, about being spoken over in board meetings, about her colleagues getting paid more than she is. And it's sort of mind-blowing, really, and you still hear stories about it. For me, I think I went through a sort of period where I felt like I was going to work and running really fast, and it was like, yeah, and getting promoted, and it was all, great. And then there was a sort of period of a number of years where I left my job, split up with my husband, moved house, all in a few years. And then a couple of years later, then my mum got ill, and then my mum died a few years ago as well. And it's sort of very difficult to do a day job really well when you've got all of that going on.
Thank you for sharing that. And sorry about your mum. That must have been sort of challenging dealing with all those things together. What strategies have you used to get upstream?
I talk about this one little bit of advice quite a lot because I feel like it's been such a sort of healthy thing for me. Um, and that is, and I had some therapy when after my mum died, and that was sort of more focused around grief. But I've had some therapy since then in a sort of more self-development, constructive way. And I I think it's really fascinating to do that, to kind of examine your reaction to things, to sort of understand the way your brain works a little bit better. I think it gives you good insight into yourself, which is very important. But um, during one of those conversations, I was having a chat about something I was doing, and I was sort of stressing about it a bit. And I said, I'd like to learn some coping mechanisms um, for dealing with sort of periods of stress, and because I tend to sort of think about, what if it goes wrong, or what if this happens, or what if I send this and they hate it, and her advice was just try reframing that to just, but what if it isn't? And I really try and apply that as much as possible to lots and lots of different things. And whenever I can feel myself starting to think, wouldn't it be easier to just not do this? Would it be easier to actually just take this other path? Or, is this the right thing to do? Are they going to like it? Is it going to work? And I start to stress about, this, I don't, is this the right thing? And to sort of doubt yourself is just to sort of come at it from a different angle, which is just, what if it is? And what if it does go all right? And what if you send the document and they say, this is great, thank you. And then you do the work and it goes fine, just to sort of add that lens to it, like a little sort of critical voice in my head, just sort of switching the narrative around. But I find myself doing that a lot, and I find it incredibly helpful.
Thank you for sharing about therapy. You've talked a lot around sort of culture and in the different environments that you've worked. So I've read your hugely useful report where we need to talk about culture. What inspired you to do that research on culture?
Communications and strategy has always been you know, my central passion, and it always will be. But I was increasingly finding that the conversations I was having with very senior people were were centered around communications and strategy, but we ended up so much of the time talking about people, but then never doing anything about the people element of it. So, you know, you'd start by saying, how's the business doing? Yeah, it's going really well. We're launching this new thing. We want to run a campaign on that thing because we want to do more of X, or we want to do more of Y. But, the people seem down. There's low morale. We've had a lot of change at leadership level. There's a bit of drift with people not really understanding. We can't really do much here because the team there is underperforming. But, anyway, we've got to run this campaign, and I thought, I think that would be better. The campaign would be better if we fix these problems as well. The problems that we keep talking about, particularly post-lockdown, where just lots of businesses would just didn't know what to do with their people and how to, like, are they coming back in? Are they not? Is everyone working remotely? And how do we connect with everyone remotely? And half the leadership team don't trust that people are actually doing their work when actually they're working harder than they were before. You know, how are we dealing with issues like mental health? How are we getting everyone connected with the strategy? How are we reacting to some of the big issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion that are going on? And I just felt like it just felt like everyone was in a bit of a mess over it. And so I wanted to speak to senior people that held senior roles and therefore quite a lot of responsibility around culture anyway, or should have done. Um, but also because they had lots of experience in various organisations on the way to wherever they've been. Most of them had decades worth of experience in all sorts of different organisations. And I wanted to speak to them about what is it? What makes for good culture? Because I felt like it was becoming overly complicated. And actually, the best places I've ever worked at were where everyone in that organization was single-mindedly focused on one thing. They knew where the business was going, and everyone was working towards that. And there was a unity and a camaraderie um, in that single-minded focus. And we talked about it all the time. Where are we going? Where are we going? How are we doing? How are we getting there? And it was momentum, and the point at which, and I think that focus enables you to, not have infights between divisions, and not to have chit chat and gossip and maliciousness and toxicity, and there's no space for bad leadership or poor management or underperformers, because the business is going fast, and those sort of things get found out quickly. Um, and then when they start to go wrong is when you stop communicating. And to our point earlier about why is it so important in periods of growth, it's because everyone's so busy on making money that they stop talking about why they're making money. And when that happens, organizations become rudderless. And I think at that point, that is when people just start setting up their own little mini cultures. You start to get toxicity, you start to get underperformers, you start to get bad leadership. Um, and often that is, you know, at, at best, that makes for an underperforming company, but at worst, that can bring businesses down. People leave, leadership leaves, and they never find their way forward again. They can't hire quick enough because no one wants to go there because everyone knows it's a bad place to work. And I think there are lots of examples of that all across all sectors. It started off with just having conversations with people to sort of see what they thought and see what their views were, and particularly from a leadership position. I felt like there was a lot of senior execs were kind of saying, well, I care about culture, but the boss doesn't, and they're rubbish at it. And then a lot of bosses saying, well, I care about it, that's all I think about, but they're not. So I wanted to get a sense of, like, are we all agreed on this? And if so, what are the simple steps that we can take to just get back to making, a good culture, just that, a place where people can thrive, where people understand the kind of business they work for and are happy working there. I don't sort of think it needs to be more complicated than that. So that's the sort of rationale behind it.
And what does culture mean to you? Because it often means different things to different people, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. For me, it's just the feel of the place. It's kind of, is this a place, it's working at a business where you know what kind of business it is, you know where it's going, you've got an idea of what the next 5 to 10 years is going to look like at that business, and that you are able to develop and do well in your job. if all of those things are in place, then for me, it feels like a that is those are the ingredients of good culture to me. And it's a place where you can come in and feel happy to be there. You feel respected in your position and what you're contributing. Even if you're I like that sort of NASA anecdote about the cleaner helping to put the man on the moon. It's like every single person in the organization knows their role in making that business a success and are respected for it, regardless of what it is. And I think if that can happen, everyone wins. It's not given the strategic attention it deserves. That was the main thing for me. And that being, businesses sort of say, no, we've got a HR team, so it's fine. That culture's fine. It's like, well, your HR team looks after your people, the policies that sit behind them, their wages, their entitlements, and all the rest of it. But if your HR director is not in the boardroom, if they're not, if culture isn't being talked about at the most senior levels, then it's not being talked about in the right way. And it's not a thing that you outsource. Everybody should have a say in it, right? Everybody within that business should understand what the culture should be like and what their role is in maintaining and developing it. And it's when it's kind of the responsibility is given to one person in an organization that is impossible to uphold and maintain. And good cultures are about collective endeavor. Everyone should feel like they're responsible for creating a nice place to work, right? That's sort of a nice empowering thing for people.
So it's clear that the report's got some great findings. What are your hopes for the future of the culture report and the impact?
Yeah, I want to do more work with organizations on their culture, number one. Because I'm starting to do that already. And I think often with small tweaks, big impact can be had. And for me, the joy of that is seeing people happy in their jobs, happier in their jobs, developing, feeling more challenged, and those organizations doing better, performing better. That is what I want. But also, and there's a reason why I called the report We Need to Talk About Culture, because I think we need to talk about culture. But what I'd like as an outcome of it is for more of us to be talking about culture. And I've found that most of the conversations I've had with people so far have prompted, yeah, actually, we need to think about that. And actually, maybe maybe everyone doesn't understand the strategy of the business. And actually, maybe some people do have different views on what the business actually stands for. And I think if we all just talk about it a bit more, particularly at those senior levels, I think those are the sort of changes that will happen. Hopefully, that's the dream anyway.
Fingers crossed. Could you share one or two of the 8 recommendations that came out of the report?
There's 2 others that I think are most interesting. Some of them are obvious, which is about good communications. It's about writing things down. But the 2 for me, which I really like, and it sort of prompts quite good conversation, is there's no family in team, and this is the premise that a lot of organizations got into a sort of funny thing of talking about family all the time. Oh, we're just a family, and actually people don't like that. People don't, really want to go to work for another work family, and often it's what they actually want is to be a player in a sort of high performing team. And there's a difference there. The family being, we all just muck in, we all just help each other out, it's sort of very fluid, the sort of boundaries between our roles. And actually most people they want boundaries. They want to know exactly what their self-development path is. They want to know how they're getting from here to here. They want to know how all the players on the team interact with each other and support each other and have clear development and sort of career paths. They don't want a family outside of their own family, because I feel like as well, even just having conversations around family, work family, it kind of breeds a sort of an emotional response, which you just don't need that at work. In fact, you want more, less emotion, I think, in those sort of relations, because I think that can sort of breed toxicity. So I think that's an interesting one, which is, to what extent are businesses a high-performing team, or are they a sort of slightly dysfunctional family? And I think most of the time, if you sort of sit somewhere in the middle, is about right. And then just the last one I'll touch on is just be the culture you want to see, and it's just model the behavior. But I feel a lot of the time culture can be delegated, or I've had conversations with people who are like, oh, we talk about culture all the time. No, you've got it wrong. Like, you're finding it's wrong, because we talk about it all the time. I was like, yeah, but what do you do about it? Having conversation about it is one thing, but if you all walk out of the room with no clear actions or responsibility, or if you say, right, everyone needs to come into the office, Monday through Wednesday. I mean, I'm not going to, because I'm leadership, I'm going to work from home, but everyone else needs to. Then, again, that just makes for a bad culture where you're saying one thing and doing the other. And most people, if you work in an organization, you will look to your leadership team and your boss, and you will model in some way the behavior that you see. And if they are being passionate and clear and articulated and about the strategy and talking about the business and giving you reasons and motivation to come in every day, then you will come in and sort of act in the same way and treat the people that you manage in the same way. But if you're not doing that, and you're evasive and non-communicative, and then that will flow through the organization.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing those. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners?
I think the point at which you stop caring what other people think of you is an important one. And I think everyone goes through that point. A lot of the time, we can be held back from doing things by being worried about being judged by others. And I think the stark reality of that is, most of the time people aren't thinking about you. And that can be quite a harsh sort of thing to sort of understand. But I actually think the point at which you just stop caring and you just do it, you rely on your own judgment and maybe the judgment of a close circle of friends. But you just do things. You don't worry about failure so much. I think that's the point at which is very freeing, I think, particularly from a career perspective, the ability to sort of just try things. And secondly, and sort of linked to that, is just persist, just keep going. And, sort of don't worry too much about things needing to be perfect, the perfect this, the perfect that, the perfect job, the perfect business. Just sort of do things and keep going, and you'll end up with, probably a good career, and you'll be happy and it will be fine. Do you know what I mean?
Fantastic. Wise words indeed. Thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us today. Thanks for listening to Against the Tide, brought to you by Think for Wellbeing, the strategic consultancy for social change makers, with thanks to Louise Kavanagh at Purposeful Marketing and the team at Sticks and Glass. Subscribe to Against the Tide wherever you get your podcasts, so you never miss an inspiring episode.